Welcome to the Live Like It's True podcast. Here on the show, my guests and I talk through some of the most interesting and astonishing stories of the Bible. And then we ask, how can we live like this story is true? I'm your host, Shannon Pepkin. I am an author, a speaker, and a Bible teacher. And here on the podcast, I'm inviting you to think of these stories in the Bible as containers for truth. Each one gives you a new way to reject the lies, to rehearse the truth, and to invite other people to do the same. So I hope that this episode is going to inspire you to better know the story, share the story, and live like the story is true. Dr. Allen, welcome to Live Like It's True.
Thank you for having me.
Let me just read your formal bio so that our guests can get to know you. You are served as the chaplain at the Denver Rescue Mission, and you helped homeless addicts by removing them from an urban setting, empowering them to operate a farm. And your role was providing counseling, spiritual care, and job training. And so your work with these clients inspired the research to a unique blend of neuroscience and spiritual formation. So it's not every day I get to talk to a neuroscientist who also loves the truth of the Bible. But this was the impetus for your new book, The Brain Change Program, 6 steps to renew your mind and transform your life. So congratulations on that project, Dr. Allen.
Thank you very much. It was a long time coming, and
yes, it sounds like it. Yeah, you've really invested. And so, like I said, this is sort of a different sort of interview for me. I'm so honored with the chance to talk with you. But what I want to do is start with your process, like what prompted the book. I want to hear a little bit of your story and some of the people that you worked with, their stories. And then I want to circle back to talking about how we can use the stories of the Bible to change our brains and our lives. Like that's really where we're going with this. But I want to set up the topic I read the introduction. And, here on Live Like It's True, we love stories. And I love that you opened your book with stories of two men, Raymond and Charles. Could you just kind of tell us your experience with both of those guys and how this led to writing the Brain Change Program?
Well, we had Raymond, and this was a challenging story. It's a story of failure, because failure can prompt action. We had this one client in our rehabilitation program, and he did everything right. He was the poster child for following the rules and should be going on to good things. Yeah. It comes time for his graduation. He comes up to give his testimony in front of all the other clients, and he says, "Only chumps work when there's Social Security. Jack Daniels crack and the streets of Las Vegas are calling me. I'm out of here."
Oh my goodness.
And this is it's his testimony.
It's his graduation, and he's saying, only chumps. What was that? Only chumps. Oh, when there's Social Security.
Social Security.
So he's not going to work. He's going to go, and he's going to go after the Jack Daniels.
Yeah.
And everybody in the room was like, wait, what? This was a surprise? Did anybody look over his speech?
No. He was going to give a testimony of going on to good things. And so everyone is shocked.
Yeah.
His church,
devastating.
The church he had joined came out to watch this too. And they've been investing in him. And so everyone's heart is just breaking. And he gets up and leaves. And so we're just like, and so all these existing clients, like, if he fails, what hope do I have?
Yeah. Yeah. And this was not the rock star moment you were hoping for. No. Inspiring. And oh my goodness, I can imagine how devastating that was for everybody.
Yeah. And so we're doing damage control with the existing clients, trying to help encourage them, and ourselves we're second guessing, saying, what could we have done better?
Right.
What did we miss that this would happen?
Yeah.
And so this really inspires me to think, okay, how can programs like that do better? And how can we do better for anyone in the church that wants to change their way of thinking and change their way of life?
At that point, when you were working with it's Raymond, right? Is the first one. At that point, when you were working with Raymond, did you have any background in neuroscience?
I had studied biology in undergrad.
Okay.
but I was bored with the lab work.
Sure.
But I loved ministry in my campus Christian group.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to seminary after biology.
Okay.
And so I already had a background in both. And so I knew the people we're dealing with have these damaged brains. And also, a lot of times their addiction is their worldly attempt to take trauma and difficult thoughts captive,
Sure.
but in a very destructive way.
Okay. Yeah.
And so I was thinking, okay, I want to know some practical ways that we can put into practice. How do you take every thought captive?
Okay.
And I went back to my science and said, okay, if I study more of the brain, I can learn more about how God has built our brains to learn and grow. And maybe I could bring that together with the Bible and get some insights on how to do this better.
I love that. I love that. But before you go to the brain science, talk to us about Charles. Tell us about him.
Okay. He was the opposite of Raymond. Uh, he came to us, he was known as the crazy man downtown who wore green cowboy boots and yelled at the air.
Oh, gosh.
He was addicted to methamphetamine and had a number of mental illnesses. And he came to us, and it was a wrestle match the whole way. He kept his residency just barely. He
Okay.
made bare minimums, not the star, bare minimums. And we'd be wrestling with him about things of basic hygiene, showing up for work. It was a fight all the way through. Halfway through his program, he comes running into my office with a certificate saying, "Guess what, chaplain? Guess what? The state mental hospital has now certified me free from all 5 mental illnesses." That is a transformation.
Yeah, that's
It's like,
amazing.
now I have a certificate that says I'm legally sane. Do you have one of those? And I mean, that was a pivotal watershed moment for him. He still struggled about some things in the program, and it came to his graduation. He graduated, and then he quietly went on to be successful.
Wow.
He got his AA degree. We helped him do that while he was in the program.
Okay.
And then he went on to do tech support for air traffic control computers.
Fantastic. Fantastic. That's
Amazing.
amazing. Yeah, that is amazing transformation. And so I'm sure you're thinking, okay, what what was the difference here, right?
Like, we couldn't figure out the difference. It's something that's going on inside their head
Okay.
that's hard to pin down sometimes. So I wanted to study more about the brain.
Well, and we're
Uh,
so glad you did. And this book, The Brain Change Project, I want to say right up from, or is it project or program?
Program.
Program. The
Brain
brain,
change.
yep, the brain change program. I want to say right up front, like this isn't just for addicts or those who are severely struggling with addiction. It's for people like me, I think, who struggle with like what I eat or just the bad habits, the bad patterns. I think your work applies to all of us. And I just want to call out some of the statistics that you offer. You say that women, and most of my listeners, I think, are women. I think we have a few men, including my husband, but women are twice as likely to be diagnosed with anxiety as men. Anxiety is a huge problem for women. 12 million women in the US may experience depression each year. That's a huge problem. And 1 in 8 women may experience depression at least once in their lifetime. And so, like, women are going through anxiety and depression. And we just are releasing a teen book called Comparison Girl for Teens. And the anxiety in teens is just like the CDC's statistics are atrocious. It's awful what's happening with our teens. So our response, as the church and as women is usually like, well, okay, feeling this shame. Like I've got all these bad habits. I can't break them on my own. I know they're sinful. And so look, I should have more faith and I should pray more and I should attend church and be in a small group, but we try our best and the struggle continues. So what can you offer? Not just, well, what did you figure out between these two clients that you were serving, Raymond and Charles? Like what did you learn in all of your training that can help all of us.
Well, my natural state is a anxious perfectionist. So
Okay.
I can relate.
Okay. Huh.
It's when you lay down in bed and your brain's telling you all the things you could have done better during the day.
Yeah.
And okay, now I need to take my thoughts captive, but it's easier said than done.
Oh,
Uh,
so true. I do that after interviews that I'm the one in your seat, I'll think, "Oh, why did I say that?" Because I can't edit theirs. Why did I say that? Why did I didn't sound right, and I can't sleep. It goes on and on in my head. I get it. God's promises are like a set of parentheses. The first one is when he makes the promise. The second one is when he keeps it. And you never have one without the other. But often there's this long stretch between the two, much longer than we first imagined, right? That's what we see in Sarah's story found in Genesis 12 through 21. God promised a son, but in this wide stretch between the parentheses, she wondered, would God keep his promises? Could he? I'm Shannon Popkin, inviting you to come find the answer to those questions, both for Sarah and yourself, in my brand new 6-week Bible study titled Shaped by God's Promises, Lessons from Sarah on Fear and Faith. Find out how you too can be shaped by God's promises in the waiting.
and so I wanted to learn principles that could benefit everyone. And
Mm,
if it can help the 10-year methamphetamine addict, it should be able to help me with going to
absolutely.
bed and my anxieties.
Yeah.
What I discovered is that the brain can change throughout your entire life. It's not a
Okay.
machine, it's not fixed.
Mm,
New neurons are always being produced, and existing pathways in your brain can grow strong as you use them, or
okay.
weaken if you don't.
Okay.
And so, like with my clients, so if you have been an addict for 10 years, you have this giant pathway in your brain for addiction.
Sure.
And your brain wants to take the quickest and easiest path. So it'll take the
Mm,
highway you built
okay.
whenever life throws you a curveball. Or if it's anxiety, you have this big highway for anxiety, your
Mm,
brain's going to head that route whenever you get a curveball.
huh. So these are learned habits, things like addiction and anxiety. I don't necessarily think of I think of it as something that happens to me, right? Not something that I'm actively choosing, but our
Well,
brains.
it doesn't just come from what we choose. It come These pathways in your brain can be formed by just the messages you hear around you.
Mm, yeah,
What messages have you heard growing up?
yeah.
What messages has society given you? And these create highways in your brain, but now we can make a choice to try to weaken the highway
Mm,
and strengthen the little path onto the side that might
yeah,
be unused. Calm,
yeah.
peace, faith.
Yeah. Yeah, I've with both of my books, my first two books, Control Girl and Comparison Girl, I created a meditation at the end of each lesson because I think, and these aren't new thoughts in these meditations. I mean, maybe there was a new idea explored in the lesson, but these are things that we say we believe and yet our behavior doesn't match it. And so like meditating on the truth and rehearsing it over and over. Is that what you're talking about? Like not
Yes,
what we think about, or are you talking more about our actions?
they both go together,
Okay.
but those meditations you had was spot on in terms of helping someone change their brain if they
Hmm.
rehearse it.
Okay.
You touched on neuroscience without even knowing it.
How about that? Yeah. And that's really just the word of God, right? And all of
Amen.
this truth is grounded in God is the one who told us to renew our minds.
And like I tell people, science, none of this is new. Science is just catching up to the Bible.
Yeah.
And by knowing these things, it gives some more depth to
Yeah.
what we need.
It's interesting you said that. I just called my husband before we got on because he threw out some statistic recently that I was like, oh, that is so interesting. He's a data scientist, and one of his co-workers said that the highest AI model has 5 billion parameters. So if you think of a spreadsheet with 5 billion, I don't know, rows and columns, but the brain, he said, has 100 trillion neurons, and each neuron has 7,000 synapses. I don't even know what that means, but he was just saying, like, the brain. I mean, I know that trillions are way more than billions, and so, like, we think AI is so amazing, but the human brain is astounding. Is my point?
I agree. And I'm not a jargon person.
Sure.
And so in my writing, I wanted to write in a way that even my former clients could understand.
Well, and I so appreciate you did. Like, when I read the first few chapters of your book, I'm like, oh, I can read this. This I can read. I love that. That sets this book apart.
Thank you. And so to go back to your meditation, what that does is you're deliberately moving off, say, your anxiety pathway and trying to create a new highway. And every time you make a deliberate shift, you're taking one brick off the highway you want to dismantle and putting it in the new place. This is not a magic pill that is instantly successful. It's a discipline.
Sure.
And so it's like with former clients, it's like you might have to do that redirect 60 times a minute when you start. But each time you're doing a construction in your brain.
Yep.
Weakening the highway, strengthening the good one.
Yeah.
And it gets easier over time. Then it's only 30 times a minute, and then
Yeah.
only every couple minutes.
Yep.
And it gets better the more you work at it.
You know what? That is exactly what I have said before when teaching on Galatians 5, where we're told to keep in step with the Spirit. A step is a moment. It's a choice of a moment where that's the passage where it says, we've got two desires, the desires to gratify the flesh and the desires of the Spirit, and they're in opposition to each other. And so keeping step with the Spirit is making a choice, and it's little by little. It's transformative. And I don't want to minimize those big transformative moments in our lives, but I do think that what I've noticed and what I've experienced in my own life is the greatest transformation doesn't just happen in a certain experience or a moment in my life. It happens in little by little choices, where I'm keeping in step with the Lord and not taking control back into my own hands. And I love in the book that you contrasted, was it Paul and Jacob,
Paul and
right?
Jake. Yeah.
Like the transformation in their lives. And we've talked about both of those characters here on the show. Paul's story is just astounding. This in the middle of the road experience where he sees a bright light and Jesus changes his life like in a matter of days. And his transformation is decades, right?
Yeah.
Days and decades.
I mean, we all want the Paul program where we can be microwaved into instant change.
Mm-hmm.
It can happen, and praise the Lord.
Yep.
But it's not the majority. Most of us are on the Jacob program where it's a long, hard fight.
Yes.
And Jacob got to the point where his character was changed and his name was changed.
Mm-hmm.
And so can we.
Yep.
And I tell people, who would you rather have as a mentor? Someone that was microwaved into change, or someone that fought the long, hard fight and came out victorious?
Yeah, those who were microwaved into change don't really have a lot that they can help us with. They're like, well, God just changed me. And I have a friend who says that, God just took away her alcoholism in a moment. Well, she doesn't really have a lot to offer me when we sit down for, what can I learn from you? I mean, this is something God did for her, and that's amazing. And I don't want to minimize that, but I think you're right. Like, that's actually encouraging for people like me, where the change is a little bit more gradual.
And God has something for you in that journey,
Mm-hmm.
and you will learn things that you can offer other people.
Yep. Yeah,
And
absolutely.
even if there's failure, what I tell people, as long as you don't stay down, you don't lose the construction you've already been doing in your brain.
Yes.
Those bricks have already been moved.
Yep.
Get right back up and keep going.
Okay.
And so there's the hope. Brain construction, you don't lose it if you keep going.
That does give a lot of hope. It's not like, I start up back, at step one, and I've already taken 6,000 steps in the same direction. I don't have to go backward. I've just taken one step in the wrong direction, right?
You're not back to square one.
Yeah. Yeah. That's great. But talk to us about willpower. Why is it
Okay.
not willpower that makes this change?
Well, I tell people willpower doesn't work.
Mm.
And here's the
I've
biological reason.
experienced that.
I know. We all have at this point. And this is why willpower doesn't work. And it goes back to biology. If, like a former client, is trying to willpower himself away from alcohol, saying, must not use alcohol, must not use alcohol, what is he thinking about? The alcohol. What
Exactly.
pathway is he strengthening? The alcohol.
Okay.
Or if I'm telling myself, don't be anxious,
Yeah.
anxiety's on my brain, and I'm making anxiety worse.
Yeah.
And so I tell people what you need to do is don't resist, replace.
Mm.
Direct your brain to something new and good
Mm.
instead of focusing on the problem. My little
Yeah.
story is every year we'd take our clients to Mexico to build an orphanage.
Okay.
And people would tell us, are you crazy taking addicts to Mexico?
That does sound a little crazy.
Are you going to come back with anyone?
You'll
And
lose them all.
lose it all. But we've never had a problem because they were focused on doing
Mm.
something good for orphans and doing God's work.
Mm. That's amazing.
And so they were on a completely new brain path.
Mm.
So I tell that to everyone, instead of trying to willpower your way away from something,
Mm-hmm.
focus on something new and good.
That's really good. What I think is unique about this podcast is that we talk about truth encapsulated in stories, these narratives of the Bible. And I find this really interesting, Dr. Allen. Whenever I talk with people, uh, and ask, like, where do you find the truth that you need in the Bible? Like the truth that you want for this transformation, where do you go? Most often people go to the New Testament parts of their Bible, like the teaching parts, the epistles, these verses that kind of encapsulate the truth. But I see this value in going to stories. And if I can just offer maybe a couple of reasons why I choose stories, and I'm not saying I do memorize verses also, but stories are more concrete. These verses that encapsulate truth are often talking about abstract things, where stories are talking about concrete imagery that make it easier to remember. It's easier to remember a story than just test this out and think of the last sermon or podcast that you listen to. The easiest parts to remember will be the stories that we're told. It's just our brains are wired for stories. And then stories package up such good theology. They encapsulate truth. They use an economy of words to package up so much more than just those actual words. So the Good Samaritan story is 330 words in my Bible. And we had a guest, Amy DiMarcangelo. She's written an entire book on the Good Samaritan story, and hers is not the only book on that story. And then I just looked up Peter's denial. So I didn't want to just give an example of a story that Jesus told, but an actual story about people in the Bible, things unfolding. So Peter's denial in Matthew 26 is 157 words. Think of all the sermons and books written on Peter denying Christ, and so repeatedly, I've made the suggestion that we use stories to rehearse truth. And so here's where I want to lean on your expertise, okay, Dr. Allen. So what is unique about using stories to renew our mind with truth?
I think you're going a great direction with stories. You've mentioned our brains are wired that way to accept stories. And this was the real surprising thing for me in this research is science has discovered that your brain cannot tell the difference between imagining doing something and doing it for real in
Wow.
terms of how it forms your brain.
Huh.
There might be more legal consequences doing something for real, but it's
Okay.
just imagining it changes your brain in the same way.
Okay.
Uh,
Interesting.
and so you can see, okay, that makes sense why Jesus says if you hold on to certain things in your brain, it's like you're sinning because
Yeah.
it's forming your character.
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is where stories can be very powerful because it engages your imagination.
Mm.
And when someone is telling a story, the listener enters the story in their imagination as if they're the character there.
Yeah.
And that experience actually changes their brain at a subconscious level. I mean, they're not memorizing a new truth, but they're being changed by a truth at a deep level.
Hmm. Yeah,
Uh,
I read in Talk Like Ted, they talked about using in the chapter on stories. They quoted some neurologist who talks about neurocoupling, where when the storyteller is telling the story, they're using the same part of their brain that the listener is using, and so it kind of couples them in the same experience. And I've thought about like that's interesting to me as a storyteller, as a communicator, but also think about God. Like he could have communicated in any way that he chose, but he chose to let truth unfold in a story where there's a father and there's a son, and the father gives his son, and the son dies for the sake of the other children that he loves. Like, I think God allows us to, as we see the story unfolding, there's like this neurocoupling, and we understand who God is. Like we understand him, and so we enter into the story in a different way than we would just as a bystander learning about truth. We're like entering into the truth.
mhm.
That's also what I loved about my conversation with Amy D. Marcangelo. She's talking about the story of the Good Samaritan, and she's like, there's this man asking Jesus, how do I know who my neighbor is? And he wants like draw up the parameters, like who's my neighbor? I want to love him. I want to, just check that off my list. And Jesus tells a story where like it's a story, and you can't help but identify with the guy who's bleeding on the side of the road. And then who's your neighbor? Like, who do you want your neighbor to be when you're the one bleeding?
Mhm.
And so that's, stories there, yeah, I'm just identifying with what you're saying about how, you're experiencing it more than
Yeah.
just learning about it, right?
Mhm. You're
And
experiencing emotions of everything.
right. And your brain can't tell. Explain that one more time about how your brain can't tell the difference.
So, for example, a musician, and musicians have known this. If you practice in your imagination, you can improve your performance,
Interesting.
even if you're sitting on your hands while you do it.
Okay.
You can actually improve your ability.
Wow.
Athletes do that. They say, envision throwing the ball so it goes in the basket, or hitting the puck so it goes in the net.
Wow.
And they can get better by imagining doing it the right way.
That's
And,
so interesting.
and so their brain is changing the same way as if they were actually hitting the piano keys with their fingers. And so, and then also and this will be a sad story. I had one client tell me it was easy to cheat on my spouse because I did it 1,000 times in my head already.
Hmm. That's so
And
sad.
and even though earlier on in history, he may have thought I would never do that.
Yeah. Yeah.
But imagination changed his brain to make it ever more a reality.
Right. And so these ideations, like we talk about suicidal ideation, is
Mhm.
um, so damaging, so destructive, so dangerous,
Yeah.
because we're laying down those bricks, right,
Hmm.
of the pathway in our brain by not actually doing it, but thinking about it. So on the positive side, we can think about good truth
Hmm.
wrapped up in stories. And yeah, so how, any other thoughts on that? Like, how could we use a story? Like, I mean, I'm just imagining maybe I struggle with anxiety. So, how could I use the imagination required to think through a story from the Bible to help with my problem on anxiety?
For anxiety, a good one to go to would be Jesus calming a storm. That's a go-to one. And in this case, I would tell someone, well, read the story through a couple times and then really use your imagination to put yourself in that situation.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine there's a storm. Imagine the smell of the air
Mm-hmm.
and the smell of the rain, the sound of the waves, hearing the other disciples shouting and yelling because they're
Yeah.
anxious too.
Yeah.
Imagine the strain of your arms trying to pull at the ropes. And then you look over and see a napping Jesus and feeling so frustrated inside.
Yeah.
It's like, Jesus, why aren't you up here dealing with the anxious situation. You must struggle with procrastination here because I'm in this anxious moment. Where are you? You're over
Mm-hmm.
there napping.
Mm-hmm.
And just picture yourself, let yourself feel those feelings. And then until you get to the point where you get so frustrated, you shake Jesus awake and say, Lord, Lord, do something.
Mm-hmm.
And then you see Jesus just calm the storm.
Yeah. Yeah. And
And
that's the part I like to imagine because I mean, a storm doesn't go away in an instant, right? A natural storm, it doesn't go away in an instant. It takes, it builds up and then it de-escalates, right? There it's gets the thunder stops and then the rain gets softer and then it goes away gradually. But when Jesus calms that storm, it calmed in an instant. I love that. And it just, I think, demonstrates his power, right? And his
mhm.
authority over all of the things that are happening to us in this broken world.
and
Jesus has that authority. And I think meditating on that is powerful. Yes.
yeah, and if you do run that story through your head multiple times, and then you begin to feel
Mm.
and deeply that, okay, Jesus can calm my storm.
Mm-hmm.
To switch gears to another verse that I always use in my imagination is when when God mentions in the Bible how he takes care of the sparrows and takes care of the lilies of the field
Yeah.
and don't need to be anxious.
Right.
I've just I've trained my brain and have such a big path on that when a curveball comes my way that causes anxiety,
Mm-hmm.
I just instantly have this image of a sparrow and a lily in my head.
I love it. Yeah.
It's imagination. So it just flashes up, and that's my reminder of it will be okay. God's
Yeah.
got this.
Yes.
And
Yeah.
exercise my daily faith.
Yep. I did an interview with Lisa Apollo and we talked through the story of the widow who was gathering her last sticks to feed her last meal to her son. And they were getting ready to eat their last meal and die. And that's when Elijah came. Um, and told her, to gather up the pots because the oil was going to be filling all of them. And so I love to rehearse that story when I'm feeling anxious about the future and, don't know how there could be possibly something good that could come or like that, like, or feel forgotten or feel desperate. These stories I think are powerful because what we're left to is our own experiences of life, our own experiences of the natural realm where we just can't see how there could be a way through something desperate, something hopeless, something painful. And yet the stories from the Bible are not just about the natural, they're about the supernatural. And they tell us about God and they lift our perspective to a higher plane where we get to understand who God is and look at our situation differently. So I wonder, you're talking about retelling yourself a story like in the middle of a situation. Can we front load it? Can we lay those bricks ahead of time?
Definitely. Definitely.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's the best time to do that.
Sure.
So that it is something that's automatic when you actually get into the thick of things. You don't
So
want to be
good.
scrambling for what was the truth of that story
Yeah.
in the moment.
Yep.
You want to have it so well rehearsed and so much a part of who you are that you just think this storm can be calmed,
Yes.
even though it's pretty wavy right now.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Cause I've imagined myself in that storm with those disciples. And I have thought about Jesus calming the storm. I know he has the power. Um, and I know that sometimes disciples are in boats and there's a storm raging and Jesus seems to be asleep on the job and yet he's not, right? And so, yeah, just thinking through getting ready for those moments when I'm going to need to rehearse that truth for myself. And so kind of storing it up. And so listeners, I would suggest um, having I've got our Live Like It's True workbook and I've got a whole list of false narratives. And so go find the one that you are most prone to believe, these false narratives of the world. And then find the story that most encapsulates the truth you need and rehearse that story. Like give yourself concrete imagery to go over and over in your mind. I suggest when you're laying your head on the pillow at night, go work through one of the stories of the Bible, and you're not gonna know it unless you've opened the Bible itself and read the story enough so that you can retell it in your mind. At that point, you're going to have to go get your Bible. So do it before you put your head on the pillow, and so you can rehearse it. And I just do that repeatedly. I just go through these stories that I've trained myself to remember and rehearse and to associate with the truth that I need in the moment. And so, anything else that you would add about, laying down these pathways and hope that we have for change because of this imagination that we're using?
Well, I want to encourage people, use that imagination, get those stories deep inside you, and especially before bed. Neuroscience tip, the brain does most of its growth while you're asleep.
Wow.
So if you go to sleep with that story in your brain, that'll sink even deeper in changing your biology.
So you're telling me that I intuitively was doing it right again?
Yes.
By telling myself a story. That is amazing. I love that. I didn't know there was science behind it, but intuitively, yeah, that's amazing.
Mhm.
So you talk in the book about how, like, you've got a new neuron and it's looking for a place to, build on to something else that's been built. And so it goes to
Mhm.
the places in your brain. Like if it comes to, you talked about kindness and how, if you're a really kind person and you have this new kindness or this new neuron, it's like, oh, I might deposit that near the kindness section because there's a lot going on here. But if you're a really grumpy, mean person, it's like, oh no, this looks like it's going to be shutting down. Right. And so, did I get that right?
Pretty much. New
Yeah.
neurons go to where there's the most activity.
Huh.
If it's kindness, it'll go there and help out.
Hmm.
If it's mean, grumpiness, it'll go there instead.
Okay. Wow.
Uh,
And so we're building the parts of our brain that have already experienced the most activity.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Well, man, there's just so much more in this book. I hope that listeners will go and grab a copy. I thank you so much for all of the, effort and energy you've put into preparing yourself to write this book, developing your brain in a way that is helpful for us. So I really appreciate your gift, to the church and to us individually. Thank you so much. And thanks for being here.
Thank you. It was a good time, and I'm glad to be here.
Can I just remind you that each of these stories from the Bible is absolutely true? Rather than giving us a list of facts to memorize about himself, God gave us a book filled with stories, and each one helps us to know him and to understand this overarching story that we are all in. So I hope that you'll take some time looking at this story in your Bible. To help you study, I've put together my free Live Like It's True workbook, which includes my false narratives watch list, my story elements bookmark, and more. Live Like It's True is part of the Resound podcast network. For more gospel-centered resources, visit resoundmedia.cc. We've got that link for you, along with links to any of the other resources that we've mentioned in the show notes. Thanks so much for joining me, and now it's time to go live like it's true.